Good afternoon. Since this morning, we've been looking at two very important aspects connected to Iran. First of all, the threat against the stabilization or destabilization, and also our connection and Syria. But after lunch, it's always somewhat difficult, but we're going to talk about the central reason for us having convened today, and that is the decision of President Trump to back out of the JCPOA and, of course, its implications on the entire region. So we have a whole panel of experts here. I'll try not to disturb them, but just a few words of opening in order to remind you of the openings. After all, there has been a turbulent spring and summer. The president of Trump mentioned the Vienna Agreement as being the worst in history, and he said that President Obama had thrown Israel under the wheels of the bus, and it took them a year and 4 months to actually take steps back from that agreement, and he wanted to show that he does keep his promises in contrast to other politicians and previous presidents. But so he did announce that, and after deliberations with the Israeli senior officials, and after a few days there was and after that it was followed very closely by, of course, that disclosure of Netanyahu with all the paperwork. Now, on one hand, despite what happened, the European countries and China are still remaining in, and Iran is still actually adhering to the agreement, although sometimes you've got controversial various and contradictory announcements. So we have to see the implications on the economy of Iran. There are various European countries who are frightened actually to become to have any complications with the USA, etc. In the next hour and a half, we're going to try and map out the various vested interests of the main players here, what's happened in May and what's going to happen in the near future. And the ambassador, Her Excellency Hélène, the French ambassador to Israel, Norman Roule, the senior advisor to United Against Nuclear Iran and former U.S. National Intelligence Manager for Iran, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, distinguished visiting fellow and former U.S. ambassador to Israel, and Brigadier General Reserve Eli Ben Meir, the former head of intelligence and as in the IDF. But after they each conclude the first round, I will ask additional questions, and then we'll have questions and answers. The first introduction will be of Ambassador Hélène Legal. After the elections in 2012, she became consultant to the president on Africa issues, and we're going to ask you to relate, if possible, following the American decision. What can you tell us about what happened?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear Amos, dear Sdema, thank you for your invitation. I was last week in Paris for the conference, the annual conference of the ambassadors, and my president said, I will quote him, his first words were related to the stability in the Middle East, and he said, this stability can only be built if there is ethnic, religious, and political pluralism, but even more if all stakeholders work together. It therefore requires both our involvement and our resolve in ensuring that everyone's dignity and human rights are respected, but also to pursue our collective commitment to struggle with the strategic threats to the regional stability. It's complicated but not impossible to work collectively on these issues, and we managed to have an agreement on the nuclear issues in Iran because we were united. And even this year, on another topic, on chemical weapons, we managed to create an international partnership against impunity with a new mechanism which was approved in June for attributing responsibility to chemical attacks within the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Of course, to do that, you also need force, and in the case of chemical weapons, we used also force. against the Syrian regime. We carried out several strikes on its chemical facilities. On the nuclear issue, we are supporting the opening up between North Korea and the United States. And contrary to the United States, we are committing to maintaining the nuclear deal with Iran. We have been working with Israel for 15 years to try to stop Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. This is key for the security of the Middle East, but also for the security of Europe. And as a nuclear weapon state, France feels a particular responsibility in this. We think that a nuclear Iran would radically modify the security of Israel. And as my president said, and his predecessors too, Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. Not now, not in 5 years, never. This is why, first, we brought Iran to the UN Security Council in 2006 and built a set of sanctions. After the discovery of the Fordo facility, they were powerful and effective, but not enough. They did not stop Iran developing its enrichment capacities or the plutonium research center in Iraq. That's why, in a second, we came to the idea of a combination of pressure and negotiation. And the result was a JCPOA. And what we did after the signing this agreement, we shipped out nearly all of Iran enriched uranium. We poured cement into the reactor at Iraq. We limited Iran's enrichment R&D. We put all the Iran's nuclear program under the surveillance of the agency with the reinforced monitoring of the additional protocol. We put all of Iran's nuclear procurement under international monitoring. We achieved the prohibition of nuclear military activities, especially if you look at detonics, simulation, neutronics, uranium metallurgy. None of this had ever been done before. And we are, of course, since the entry into force of this JCPOA, we have been determined to achieve a very rigorous implementation by Iran of all those provisions. And in fact, Iran complied with the JCPOA. So we have been very reluctant to give up this JCPOA. JCPOA is not a trophy, a diplomatic trophy, it's a tool to constrain Iran's nuclear program. And if we had believed there was a better tool, a better deal that could have been achieved, we would have been more than happy. Of course, this agreement is not an ideal, but you know that Iran will not be allowed to reach above 3.6. It will not be allowed to increase to 20% or above. It will not be allowed to stockpile and reach uranium, so on and so forth. We have refused to follow the US in pulling it out of the deal because we were not presenting another plan, a better plan. Maximum pressure is not a strategy. It's also a tool. Pressure alone does not stop nuclear proliferation. Just look at North Korea. If the JCPOA falls apart because of the US pulled out, we will most likely be faced with another proliferation crisis, but this time it will be a chosen proliferation crisis. My president proposed another way to tackle this issue with Iran based on 4 pillars. The first pillar is JCPOA. The second one is to negotiate a follow-on deal for Iran's nuclear program after 2030. The third pillar is to develop a framework to constrain Iran on ballistic activities. And the fourth is to push back on Iran's destabilizing regional activities, particularly in Syria. It's true that the nuclear issue is not the only issue with Iran, and that we have to approach the Iranian issues with a wider approach. This wider approach is to tackle both nuclear, regional, and ballistic issues. Of course, on the ballistic issues, we agree on all the objectives of Israel and the US, but we disagree on the tactics. We do not believe that pulling out of the JCPOA can help us in making progress on missiles or regional issues. On the contrary, we think it can be more difficult to reach agreement with Iran or to constrain Iran on missiles issues or regional issues without this JCPOA into effect. The fact is that Iran is more reluctant now than a few months ago to discuss these issues, like the ballistic issues, for example. That's why we want to preserve the JCPOA, not because of trade interest. There is no trade interest in Iran, but because of our security policy. And of course, the lifting of the sanctions was part of the deal. The idea was to have a positive impact on the lives of the Iranian people. If Iran were to cease implementing the JCPOA, of course, or degrade it, we would be in another situation. But till now, Iran is still implementing this deal. On the nuclear issue with Israel in Iran, we have a very strong dialogue with Israel on this issue, on Iran, but we do not fully understand Israel's strategy. I would say a few words to conclude on the regional aspect. On the regional aspects, it's also every diplomatic strategy have to have two sides, pressure and an engagement. With a serious and collective process of seeking political solutions. Because the only way to reduce the Iranian strategy is to create more stability in the different countries of the Middle East. Because Iran is taking benefits of wars, like in Syria, or weak states. That's why it's important to work also on political solution on the different crises of the Middle East, like Syria, of course, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and we are pushing in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And our next speaker will be Ambassador Dan Shapiro, the former U.S. Ambassador to Israel during Obama's term of office, and he is now a distinguished visiting fellow at the INSS. But before he was the ambassador, he was the head in the National Security Institute in Washington, and during the time of George Mitchell as the envoy. And he's going to speak in Hebrew today. Definitely a round of applause. And I apologize if I do make mistakes in my Hebrew, but if there's something unclear, then I will try my best. I was asked to talk and describe the United States policy vis-à-vis Iran and to try and predict what direction are they moving towards in the next few months. I must say that I think it is a severe mistake to try and predict the tactics of the Trump administration on external affairs. No, seriously, one can identify some kind of strategy, sometimes one can't, but a tactic can change in accordance, really, in the same time it takes him to write a tweet. No, seriously, in earnest, I'm saying that. Now look at, for example, everything that happened with North Korea. Within the first year of his term of office, he was attacking him and saying he was a little rocket man, and then he wrote about the summit that he was going to go there, and then he cancelled it, and he did that, and etc., etc. With South Korea, there were issues, and without consulting previously with his consultants, and then he declared that the actual nuclear threat from North Korea is totally sort of annulled, and then he suddenly understood that nothing something significant was not really achieved. And then many years of negotiations and sanctions and pressure will be necessary. And even then, one cannot actually reach a denuclearization that will be an absolute one. So vis-a-vis Iran, he has been more consistent, but not totally. He always said that the nuclear agreement was horrible, and he threatened to pull out of it, and he allowed the State Department's team, led by Brian Hook, to have negotiations with the Europeans about the strengthening, the reinforcing of the agreement vis-a-vis errors and ballistic missiles and supervision. But it was totally clear that he didn't invest in those talks, or perhaps he didn't even know the nitty-gritty detail of what was actually on the agenda in those talks, although his team said that they did sort of reach some kind of proximity in a very high percentage with the Europeans, but he decided to end those talks and abolish that agreement even before the deadline of the 12th of May. Now, the way those talks did end has implications on America's capability of reaching what it wants actually at that phase, at this phase. 2 weeks after President Trump's decision to actually pull out, then the State Department Secretary Pompeo said that there are 12 requirements, demands of Iran. Each and every one of them is legitimate and worthy, and yes, in other words, a dismantling of all the nuclear infrastructure, enabling supervision all over Iran. And of course, it's obvious that Iran is dealing in all these dangerous things that they are saying they are involved in, that they have to curb their activities immediately, and also their support of terror organizations, and of course ballistic missiles and cyber attacks, etc., etc. It was very interesting that he didn't talk about the violation of civil rights, but I won't relate to that. But it is interesting to note that. So we think that we know what the aims of this policy of the administration are. In other words, that there should have no more negative leadership here. We also know what tools that the administration intended to use in order to promote these aims. Sanctions, very severe ones, most of them against other countries, not actually against Iran, because there are already enough against Iran, but also various companies that wanted to be involved and immersed in the activities of Iran. We must all agree that such sanctions are much more effective than people did expect. And we see that at the end of the summer 2018, many European companies and some Chinese companies as well, and Indian ones as well, announced that they are leaving Iran. And that really did contribute to the decrease in the drop in the Iranian currency, and that devaluation of it. And then we're talking about the sanctions on oil, and international bank transfers, SWIFT transfers. So in other words, this tool of sanctions really did impact the regime, and it does influence their economic situation and the stability there. And I think that Razi said this morning that it doesn't perhaps destabilize it, but we do see various influences on that as well. We also know that President Trump said that he hinted that he was willing to start negotiating perhaps in an effort to reach a better agreement, a stronger agreement. It wasn't clear whether he meant only the nuclear program agreement or an agreement that would actually sort of talk about those 12 points that Pompeo demanded. Now, can those tools achieve those aims? That isn't quite clear to us, I'm afraid, less clear at least. In other words, it wasn't really clear what the real aims of the Trump administration are. Are the aims to reach a better nuclear agreement? Is it possible that Iran, and with all this economic pressure wielded on it, can they reach an agreement for a much longer term? Or would Iran agree to the eradication of all its nuclear infrastructure, or the supervision of all its military facilities, or the expansion of the agreement so that it would include ballistic missiles as well in that program? In order to reach a new agreement and some kind of alleviation of the sanctions, does Iran need to eradicate all that infrastructure? And to none of these questions did I get a clear answer. Will Iran agree to a stronger nuclear agreement? Will they accept the alleviation of these sanctions without solving all those requirements made by Pompeo? Criticism was actually voiced of President Obama's policies because he focused first and foremost on the nuclear program, because he identified that as the most dangerous threat. He didn't ignore all the other threats, but after the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, he worked in order to continue the efforts against them, but he felt that it was inconceivable to reach an agreement on all these dangerous projects that Iran was involved in. So he left it, but it was impossible. He didn't want to leave them with a progressive and advanced nuclear program. It was very difficult to really understand that the main aim was to change the actual regime and topple it, although there's a disagreement about that, although people did say in the past that they did support that. Trump even hinted at that aim in one of his interviews, because he said that one of the things on his agenda when he was elected was, would Iran want to actually overpower the whole region? Now he's saying that it's more whether this regime would survive or not. But it's very difficult to imagine that such a regime would agree to all of Pompeo's demands, and if so, will they survive? Will he survive if they do agree? In other words, this policy, will it actually impact the actual change in a regime? And of course, this would really make things very difficult for him to fulfill all Pompeo's demands. I believe that the pulling out of the agreement was a mistake, but I won't go back to that. We all want the administration to succeed. We all want Iran to stop all those negative steps it is taking. In other words, we're talking about nuclear activities. And of course, we certainly don't want any nuclear arms there, or even getting close to nuclear arms. But I have a recommendation, one main one, and a couple of other questions about to present two possible scenarios. In order to succeed in any kind of policy that the United States would like to adopt, it's incumbent upon the states to find more collaboration from the Europeans. I'm not inventing excuses for the Europeans. They've got their reasons to do so or not to do so. What I'm talking about is my own administration. When you're talking about reimposing sanctions, and that requires an ongoing effort throughout the world, because even when there is a consensus about the actual aim, there will always be people who will find ways of sort of somehow going around it and not fulfilling them. But in order to get a European sort of fully fledged collaboration, then the United States will have to go back to talks with the Europeans. And that in itself is very difficult after the way the last talks ended. One has to take into account in those talks that there are European views and opinions about what is a stronger agreement. They also have to think about priorities vis-à-vis nuclear issues and vis-à-vis non-nuclear issues. Also, again, what happens if President Trump is also what will happen if he starts with a kind of trade war or, for example, threatens to retreat from NATO. I mean, all sorts of these things can make it much harder for the European leaders to actually talk to their own people about why should they be collaborating with a leader who doesn't seem to be that positive or friendly towards the European countries vis-à-vis this JCPOA. So in other words, they're watching his conduct, and they know that this has to reflect it. I think that there are two possible paths that could take place. It's very possible that Iran will keep to the agreement and will wait. But if Iran thinks that it can survive all this economic pressure of the American sanctions, they will perhaps try and wait for another 2.5 years to see whether President Trump will be re-elected for a second term of office. If he is not re-elected, will there be another democratic administration? Perhaps they will want to go back and fulfill the JCPOA. So the Russians and the Chinese are encouraging Iran to do that. And I'm sure that there are Chinese and Russian and Indian Asian companies that are trying to help them with that. In other words, with their waiting time. So if that path is chosen, that will leave things as is at the moment with all the advantages of the JCPOA, but with the disadvantage of the fact is that America is isolated and cannot with them actually promote a stronger agreement. A second path is that the actual Iranian agreement, the JCPOA, will completely collapse. They will see that European companies are not investing. Even if some of the Russian or Chinese companies are investing, they will see that, yes, it has demised altogether. And perhaps slowly but surely at the first phase, and then it'll be... And then swiftly later on, they will enrich uranium until they actually manage to even break through towards a bomb. And that could possibly also actually bring about a curbing of that supervision, the extensive supervision of all the work. So the question is, what is the administration willing to do if that happens? So let's say if Trump is going towards a second term of office, is he going to attack Iran? I doubt that. But he always criticized any previous wars in the Middle East as being waste of money and dangerous. So maybe what could he do instead? Maybe he could give a green light to Israel to attack. Never has Israel had a green light to attack Iran. But in that specific scenario, it could be sort of on the brink kind of thing, like it was in 2012, which was the last time that Israel considered in earnest attacking. And it's a lot faster now than what would have happened had the JCPOA been in place. And then what will happen after Israel attacks? So the decision will still be in the hands of the cabinet and the Prime Minister of Israel. So those are the scenarios that the Israeli people will have to actually contend with and grapple with.
Of course, we're going to talk about some of these points further on, including the possibility of deteriorating down to an Israeli attack. I understand that you said that the administration should not have fights with anyone. What about Mexico and Canada? Is that still okay? Is this still something possible? But anyway, our next speaker is Eli Ben Meir. He retired Brigadier General Eli Ben Meir, former head of intelligence analysis in the IDF. He was VP of Cyber Intelligence at Sdema. You must have seen him a few months ago interview after many years when he was not allowed to do so on the attack of the nuclear facility in Syria. He was then head of intelligence in Israel, and in his last post, he was the head of intelligence analysis. He's also writing in Maariv, and we're going to ask him to talk about what's happening. It's been happening in Gaza since the 8th of May. Shall I speak in Hebrew or English or Arabic? Well, I'm the only one not wearing a suit anyway. And we have four basic assumptions, which I think are the most important issues to consider. First, I think that Iran is not breaching the agreement, has not breached before the pulling out and not since, because it wins, it gains from it. When they feel that they are, it's a simple business question, when they feel that they can gain more by breaching, they will breach, but so far they haven't done so. It is my working assumption. Nobody has ever managed to convince me that they renounced their vision of becoming nuclear in the long term. So I think that this is what they really want to do. But anyway, the current situation is good for Iran. It was better before May, but it's still good. As long as it's good, they will continue to behave the way they do currently. Another point, and that's true for intelligence in Europe, the US, and in Israel, may sound philosophical a little bit, but the way Israel, the Israeli intelligence sees this point. So, if you're a liar, you're a liar, and you're a liar. So if you lie once, then you'll lie a second time, and you'll always lie, if it's in your best interest. You don't have to prove again and again that they're lying. No. So we're not. We don't need to look for proof that they are breaching. I'm not saying that they are breaching the agreement, but I think that just like the story with the archive and the ink and everything, this just proves the basic assumption that these are liars, and as such we should not believe them, and they should not be believed, and that's it, even if they happen to say the truth occasionally. The third point, I'm not voting, I don't have the voting right in the US, but unlike what one may say, that that the only thing that the American president is to tweet without any underlying plan, well, I think that there is a plan, and I'm not trying to get elected there. I think that there's a sort of ideology, we can see this in the 12 points of Pompeo, but it looks like they know where they want to go. Is it achievable or not, that's a different question, but the way I see it, it's not going to end just with tweets, and the next date is November the 8th, with additional sanctions and so on and so forth. I think that this is good news. Thirdly, there's a tautology here. It's hard to envision the Iranians doing a new agreement with Trump when he's trying to pull out or to enforce the previous agreement. And so these are my basic assumptions, my working assumptions. This is what I think. These are the important things that we should follow in the next years. First, we have to understand that in America there are those who think that the agreement could be improved, and those who still think that the regime in Iran can be actually replaced, and everything that they are doing is intended to try to get there. Bolton is a major lead of this thesis. I wasn't here in the first panels, but I think that we should not count on that. And it's not a good startup to change a regime, so it's not a good idea. Let them do that on their own, but let's not try to do it for them. And let's remember that next year Iran is going to celebrate 40 years for the revolution, and for now it seems that it's the best working model for Iran, which means that there are two different voices in the American administration, and they should can a new agreement be reached? I don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, also there's something that I think is good news. That's something that I know I'm going to say, and it's pointless, but I still have to say it. We don't want to be at the front. Someone's doing the work for us, that to just have their work done by others, and maybe we can rest on our laurels, so to speak, and those who are in charge of the front will not get my recommendation, will not accept it, but I think that there's no reason for us to bear the flag. There's someone who wields the flag and has better capacities than us, so let's just settle for that. Also, thirdly, I think that the place of Europe in this is important. I think it is in our best interest that Europe should not pull out of the agreement, because I do think that the American pressure is what matters, and the American sanctions also influence the European companies, which is why the legislation in Europe in supporting those companies that are going to keep working with Iran, well, they're not important, because what really talks is the dollar, and those 18 million euros, that's fine. It's not going to have a real impact on the intensity and the power of the sanctions. So I think that it's important that Europe should be in the agreement. How can you sign an agreement with someone who breaches or cancels or annuls an agreement? Well, I think that an important factor is going to be Europe in the future, so that's why these channels have to be preserved, the channels between Europe and between Iran, until we reach some new understanding. So I would not press Europe to pull out of the agreement. And also, the ambassador mentioned other things about the presence of Iran in Syria and other places. That could help also. The fourth point is that there are two things that the Iranians are really waiting to see what's going to happen. First is November, the interim elections, how Trump is going to come out of those. That is going to have an impact on the size of the stick that he can hold. So that's tomorrow. They're waiting for it tomorrow. And also, there's a mutual influence between what's happening between U.S. and North Korea and U.S. and Iran. Each side is waiting to happen what's going to happen on the other side, but it's clear that the failure on one channel is going to have an impact on the other channel, and vice versa. A success in one of those channels is going to also to have an impact on the other channol. I'm not sure that someone is actually synchronizing those two channels, but they are very important. And finally, I think that this is not a classical example of having a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I do think that there's a significant likelihood, once the sanctions have been proven to be effective, and since they're going to increase, there are some chances of additions or changes in the agreement, whatever you call it, settlement, modification, amendment, choose the word that you like, but I think that there's a great potential due to the American efforts to have a real impact on Iran, and this is going to influence Israel on 3 points. First, the enrichment of uranium, meaning not reaching a point when the agreement just stops or ends, and they're going for nuclear program, a military nuclear program. Also, the second point is the ballistic platforms, and the third point is the local involvement: Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and so on and so forth. And each of these points, I think that there's a great potential to get the Iranians to make some concessions, whatever you call it, amendment or changes or modifications or whatever. Okay, thank you very much. Our last speaker is Norman Roule. Norman Roule has been for 34 years in the CIA. He managed programs related to the U.S., also as operational manager, and he was posted abroad in Washington in 2008. Between 2008 and 2017, he was the head of the National U.S. Intelligence Manager for Iran. Today, he's a senior consultant on the Iranian threat. Please.
Thank you very much. If I do my job right as a former intelligence officer, I'll make everyone unhappy. So let me begin by saying I've been intimately involved with all aspects of U.S. policy towards Iran for about 3 decades. So I'm just giving you a perspective of what I've seen in terms of I've supported Democrats and Republican presidents. My job has been to do what I can to make them as smart as possible on this and to work with our allies. So I'd like to begin by taking care of some myths. There are some things that are often said about JCPOA that I'd like to say are not true. First of all, the U.S. withdrawal from the deal is not a violation of the deal, period. It's not a treaty. It's not even an agreement. Lawyers will tell you that's a very big word. It's a political deal. Everyone in the P5, including the Iranians, knew that anyone could pull out of that at the time, although, truthfully, no one expected it would be the U.S. first. The second is, it is sometimes stated that prior to JCPOA, the Iranian economy was within a few months or a year of collapse. This is untrue. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. Now, when it would collapse, that's a crystal ball issue. That's not an intelligence issue. The third point I would say is that sanctions did not stop Iran's civil nuclear program. They slowed it, but that program had grown significantly while sanctions were in place, and the effort by the Obama administration was to recognize that we could have been moving towards a period of military conflict. Some facts about the right now what's going on and the deal. Secretary Pompeo's May 23rd speech included every point that was U.S. policy prior to the second, and the policy of all of most of our European allies, and certainly Israel and the Gulf prior to the second Obama administration. It's a fact. Many things that people say now is too much to ask of Iran, can't be done, it's the world. Somehow that wasn't a problem for 25 years. The IAEA has, for at least 12 or 13 reports, stated that Iran has executed its JCPOA obligations, although sometimes in a minimalist and legalist fashion. They did produce more hard water than they needed. They can't use it, but they did produce it. That was a test, perhaps, of us, but we worked a way out to prevent that from being a problem. Another fact is the science behind the JCPOA deal is extraordinary. And it is often not discussed. It's often seen as a diplomatic deal, and it certainly is. But there were a tremendous number of scientists from national labs in the United States who worked a deal to make sure that that deal had tenets to it that even if the Iranians violated a little bit, would not allow them to build a nuclear weapon as long as they maintained that deal. And that science is something that you can't just discount. This is basic math. This isn't opinion. The deal did what it was supposed to do. It halted the expansion of Iran's nuclear program. It allowed us to destroy aspects of that program. Their plutonium reactor, which appeared to have no purpose beyond making a plutonium weapon, their excuse for why they had it was obviously false, is destroyed. But it did only constrain aspects of that program for some years. And if you look at the cache of documents that the extraordinary, amazing Israeli intelligence community collected earlier this year, tells you the Iranians kept the cookbook. But more than the cookbook, it tells you how to quickly build a nuclear weapon were the Iranians to attempt to do so. And that may be a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but that's a question for lawyers and policymakers to decide. President Trump's position on the nuclear deal is not just his position. It was my privilege, my honor, to brief every member of Congress, as Dan knows, or Dan doesn't know all of this, 4 times each individually. I bet them in groups or singleton on this deal. And as a former DNI, James Clapper once put it, that's about as much fun as folding fitted sheets. So not a lot of fun. Doesn't translate well into Hebrew, I suppose, but that's a tough thing, trust me. There were hundreds of congressmen who share the position that President Trump now announces every day. And the concerns of the deal, that it would not constrain Iran's regional behavior or its missile program or its other activity, were routinely raised by hundreds of congressmen and our Israeli colleagues and others, to which U.S. policymakers replied, we would work with our European allies to develop an architecture to prevent that. I'll leave it to you to decide if we did that. The decision to leave the deal was not made easily. And in fact, the Trump administration did not develop an Iran plan for some months into the administration. And as someone who sat in those meetings, I would take it with great disrespect if anyone thought that's because they're foolish. Iran is an extraordinarily complicated plan, a complicated issue. It touches proliferation, cyber, energy, regional security, our most important allies. It sets a precedent for other issues. And the Trump administration did something very proper, for which I believe it's not given sufficient credit. It did not act quickly on Iran. He came into the office with his views on the deal being very clearly known. There is a perception in Washington, which I'm sure European colleagues do not share, that despite announcing that position, he saw little reaction from the world in Iran's other malign activities, non-nuclear. And he stated in June in a speech last year, I'm going to kill the deal. And he saw similar silence. Diplomatic discussions with Europe began last August in force, so there had always been diplomatic contact. And there have been dozens of diplomatic engagements with Europe to this day. Brian Hook now leads a entity, but I was part of this when I was in the US government. Now, we have different views than our European colleagues. And I'm a big believer that this must be done with Europe. I'm an Atlantic man, as we used to call ourselves, and history shows that Iran can only be moved by multilateral diplomatic and economic pressure. It must be multilateral. So we need to do this as a team. But when this decision was made, it didn't mean that the Trump administration was closing the door on talks. It meant that because we were engaging in diplomacy that seemed to have no end, there was a perception in Washington that allowed Iran to build facts on the ground. If anyone believes diplomacy with Iran on Syria was profitable, and we had many engagements with Foreign Minister Zarif, you should ask yourselves at the previous panel, how do you think that worked out? You willing to go through the same 18 months, 2 years on Iraq? Or maybe Yemen? From the Trump administration's position, and this is, I think anyone would agree to this, although Iran has indeed executed its JCPOA obligations, on every other issue where Iran could be conducting malign activity, every other issue, it's off the charts. From detentions of foreign nationals to actions in the region which have transformed the DNA of the region. Their proliferation of advanced missile technology has gone unnoticed by the United Nations Security Council because of Russian blocking attempts. And this will be very difficult to turn around. If anybody has a plan in here that you think will allow us to take weapons away from Kataib Hezbollah or Sahib al-Haq, please see me afterwards. I will take it back and hope to get a cash award. The Iranians have no drivers to speak with the United States. For the supreme leader to speak with the United States, let alone Israel, it undercuts the foundations, the very reason for the Iranian revolution. The idea that he would come to anyone and speak to the United States on this issue is extraordinary. He was brought to the table to speak on JCPOA not by diplomacy, although diplomacy was certainly the framework and the mechanism to do this. And wouldn't have happened without extraordinary diplomacy by Europe and the United States. They were brought to the table by crushing sanctions, which produced 2009, a presidential election with a technocrat who stated, this threatens the future of the regime. And to bring Iran to the table again on these issues, the perception is you must create that same environment. I will close with two points. There is a perception in Washington that JCPOA became the purpose of all our Iran policy. And as an observer who's now left the US government, I find it very awkward that you are either for JCPOA or you are against it. If you are for JCPOA, you talk about how dumb the Trump administration was to drop it, and you mention there are other issues we will address with other tools. But you never actually lay out what those tools are or what you're going to do by Thursday. And increasingly, some people for the deal are unable to publicly criticize Iran, to even mention that the foreign minister may have bad breath. If you are against the deal, and there are people, I would say perhaps in this country, they do not sufficiently recognize the profound science and the importance of IAEA supervision and the setback that it has provided to give the international community a chance to build a program. So now sanctions are in place. And anyone who doubted that these sanctions would do exactly what they were doing, well, that's the person you shouldn't go to ask for sanctions advice. This is all predictable and inevitable. And people may come up with alternative mechanisms or attempts, but they'll be very limited based on just the structure of the global economy and what certain laws mean. But this will take a long time to impact Iran's economy. It may take several years. It may require a new supreme leader for us to have an actual engagement. And in that time, that doesn't mean that we have a way of pushing Iran out of Syria or reducing their provision of anti-ship cruise missiles to the Houthis. I'll close by mentioning a bit of history. I recall that in around 1971 or 1972, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was working with the southern government of Yemen to close the Bab el-Mandab, to stop shipping to Israel. You now have the Iranians capable of doing the same thing, only they can now also impact the economies of every Red Sea corridor state, Egypt, and southern Europe. It's kind of silent from the UN Security Council. So if you're in Washington, that bothers you. I apologize for taking so long.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
And I hope I've offended both sides.
תודה לכל חברי הפאנל. אנחנו רוצים עדיין להפנות כמה שאלות לכל אחד מכם. Norman Roule, perhaps I'll start with a follow-up question for you. We've heard conflicting views of the Trump administration's policy towards Iran. Dan had his observations about their tactics, while Eli believes there's a larger plan here. You've spent some time with them before leaving office. What's your view? Does the president know exactly what he wants to achieve regarding the agreement?
So there is a difference between strategy, plan, and tactics. Is there a strategy? Of course there is. I've read it. And I've sat with people who have worked hundreds of hours who are mid-level and senior policy officials of the Departments of Defense, State, and Treasury to develop it. Now, a strategy doesn't lay out exactly what you're going to do to achieve this, because this is apparently financial constraints on Iran, attempting diplomatic isolation. I would now leave what I knew, pressuring Europe to return to a pressure mode against Iran, supporting local allies, allowing local allies to do what they feel needs to be done, be it Saudi Arabia or Israel, to push back on Iran. That's a general strategy. The plan, this administration is legendary for keeping its plans very close. And you may like that or you may dislike that, but their belief is by telling plans, they get people to criticize them and they tell the enemy what to do. The third point is on tactics. That almost is dependent on position. And when people ask, well, what is the Trump plan? What's next? Well, what was Barack Obama's plan to push back on Lebanese Hezbollah or Iran's missile program next after JCPOA? What was George Bush's plan to push back on Iraqi militias who killed hundreds of Americans and wounded several thousand in Iraq? Some of these things aren't knowable in advance, but that's my 2 cents as a non-policy person.
Thank you. Ambassador Legal, let's talk for a minute about the differences in style between this specific administration, the Trump administration on the one hand, and the European counterparts on the other. Was there any option for more cooperation between Europe and the United States regarding the Trump administration's position over the JCPOA, or was it a fact, a done deal that you were faced with by the Trump administration?
No, there was a moment, and my colleague said that between the moment Trump of course said from the very beginning that he didn't like the deal, but there was a moment between his arrival into power and his decision. And during this period, there were intensive discussion between the US and the EU3 on the JCPOA. The idea was to try to complement the JCPOA on some aspect, especially the post JCPOA or tougher inspections, and there were intensive discussion, many meetings at the level of political directors, but at the end it was suspended by the US, and Trump announced his decision, and since this decision, the work is much harder between Europe and the US.
Thank you. Dan, אם תרצה או לא, אתה יושב פה כנציג הממשל הקודם בפאנל.
Representing the previous administration panel. Looking back, and you're getting a lot of heat, not only from the Israeli side, after Trump's decision to pull out, what looks like a very good, tightly sealed argument, coordination between Trump and Netanyahu. Looking back, is it possible that you might have underestimated the importance of reaching a final agreement with Iran? Maybe you compromise on other things that maybe now are being discussed more. For instance, helping local terrorism, the ballistic question in Iran and Syria. So you were willing to turn a blind eye on what was going on, and things that were carried out by Assad's regime with the help of the Iranians to reach the goal which was reached in 2015 and eventually, but allowed all that to happen. Well, I wasn't a member of the team that actually carried out the negotiations. I received all the information from my colleagues who did, who were part of it. I can say, say which parts of the agreement were more important to me, but the whole idea behind the agreement was that quite clear. First, President Obama identified the nuclear threat as the most dangerous threat, which had to be dealt with before dealing with any other threat. And as I said, now we can see the problem, because when you combine all of our complaints about Iran's behavior, how to prioritize things, how to reach a stronger agreement on the nuclear, if at the same time we also require something for Syria, for Yemen, for Iraq, which may be very basic, as basic to the existence of the regime as anything else. So that was the logic. This was why the nuclear threat was addressed first. And of course, the agreement was not perfect. I said that then, and I'm saying this now. The agreement was not perfect. There has never been a perfect agreement. It's an agreement that bought time. That's what we did. That's what it did. And we always knew that we would have to extend or strengthen or improve, whatever you call it, or do a new agreement. It bought us time from the point where Iran was at the time on the brink of getting to the bomb. And where are we now on that issue? Well, they're still not breaching, they're still upholding their commitments. But if they see that they don't get what they expected to get, all the various benefits they expected to get, and if they see that all the companies are now fleeing Iran, then maybe in 18 months' time they will decide that the agreement does not serve their interests, and the agreement will collapse, and then we will be much faster back at the same point. Eli Ben Meir, after the Vienna Agreement in 2015, Israel did not have Iran as a main priority in the sight of the Israeli intelligence. The chief of staff said very clearly that the nuclear problem has been postponed. There's a window of opportunity to invest in other channels. Now things change dramatically because of the American pulling out of the agreement. So what's going on right now in the following of the Iranian nuclear program? Has Trump's decision changed the priorities again, changed the needs again, the needs of the Israeli intelligence services? Well, first of all, thinking of 2015, it's not that the Israeli intelligence stopped following Iran. No, the question, it's a question of difference between strategics and tactics, or strategy and tactics. Of course, it's still one of the main preoccupation, and the intelligence corps has created abilities that can be used in other areas too. So anyway, I think that one of the examples is what was mentioned, the operation by the Mossad. It's not something that was done within a week. It was planned and operated over a period of more than 2 years. So Iran is still in the sight of the intelligence services. Also, there's an additional report that was published recently by the UAEA, and according to which they're not breaching the agreement. Of course, they have no interest, no reason to breach the agreement, because right now they're gaining out of it. So there's no reason for them to do this. So that's why I'm assuming that they won't breach the agreement anymore than they're doing now, and they're not, in the next few months. This was true for 2015, and that's an important point. I think that 2015 has to change our point of view. The question is not whether Iran is important or not, but what are you looking for in Iran? That's the question. If you're looking for indications for various breaches and so forth, well, what we should have been looking for is those capacities that are being built that are not breaching the agreement, but which can be transformed within a very short period of time into something that does breach the agreement. And after May 2015, this has become more important. Those points that are going to turn from 0 to 1 very briefly, very quickly. And another point is the economic situation in Iran, the stability of the regime, and the internal situation. Finally, what Israel has been following since 2015 is the Iranian presence in the Middle Eastern regional space. And this is what I refer to as the salami method. It's a multifactorial problem. There's terrorism and nuclear, and they each influence one another, and there's Syria and Lebanon, and they both influence each other. So when you try to only isolate one factor and you ignore the others, well, it just doesn't work that way, because everything influences everything. That's what they did in the agreement. Only about nuclear, only for 10 years, but not this and not that. And from this point of view, this is a very basic problem about the agreement, and now the challenge is to follow them where they're getting closer, and what they do, follow what they do in the space, in the local space, and see in what are the places where we can get them back to the negotiation table. Another question to Hélène Legal. Your colleagues in the panel have mentioned several times the Israeli exposure of the archive of nuclear documents in Iran, and this was in the beginning of May, and maybe 1 week later Trump announced, I think this was pre-planned, that he's pulling out of the agreement. But during those few minutes when he was speaking, reading, if I remember correctly, reading a text, he also mentioned the documents presented by Israel as another testimony that strengthens his opinion. What was the French position? Did France also, was France influenced by the exposure of the documents? Did that influence the French position?
Okay, it's a very sensitive issue and I don't like to discuss it publicly, but of course we are among those who have these archives, and we thank the intelligence community of Israel for sharing this information with us. We are still working on it because they are huge documents, very useful. And they are confirming what we know, but with many details. So that's why it's very interesting. What will be interesting in the future is to see how these archives can be used by the agency. And I think we all share the point of view that they have to be studied also by the agency, and we will support the actions of the agency respecting to the archives.
Thank you.
Another question to all of the panelists. I'm not sure if the ambassador will want to relate to this question, but 2 weeks ago, Daniel Sobelman, published in Harvard a study, and he works in the Hebrew University today, and he analyzes the relationship between the US and Israel in the context of the Israeli threat to attack Iran during the first Obama regime, 2009 to 2012-13, and the conclusion that comes out of this study is mostly, he doesn't say it in so many words, but he does say that Israel has brought has led some sort of a process. Netanyahu and Barak at the time, Minister of Defense, made the impression that the Israeli intelligence and security leaders are not certain about this, but that Israel is just about to attack, and that to a great extent actually caused a domino effect which ended in worsening or increasing the sanctions in the interim agreement and in the agreement that was finally signed in 2015. Can I ask you to relate to this assertion in the study? And I think, Dan Shapiro, that in the end of your words in the beginning of this panel, you mentioned something about that. Do you think that we may reach a point where Israel really considers attacking the nuclear sites in Iran on its own accord? Well, I did get, I was interviewed indeed for this study that you mentioned, and in that interview I said that I thought that there were some serious considerations inside the serious deliberations about whether to attack or not. This was 2012. Dan Sobelman says that this must have been some sort of a stunt trying to influence the Americans. Maybe there's a little bit of that too, but it wasn't only that. I think it was a real serious intention, and some people were sitting here and know this much better than I do. I think that there were some serious talks about that, and there's only one person who can really eventually make that decision. But there is no doubt in my mind that this debate inside the Israeli government, which we knew of, I know that this really did take place, and it did definitely have an influence on the US. First, because the US tried to convince Israel not to attack, and also using the possibility that Israel might attack in order to intensify the sanctions and get more cooperation from Europe, from China, and so on and so forth. So, if we look forward and thinking whether there's a possibility in the foreseeable future that Iran might breach and return to enriching uranium and returns again to the edge, then of course this is a very important instrument, a powerful instrument that the administration can use in order to ask for more cooperation from other partners in the international community. But the question is whether it is going to be President Trump's interest to convince Israel not to attack, if Israel is really considering to attack or will be considering an attack. I think that it is better not to have Israel attack, of course. What about you? Well, I agree. I think that the Syrian story also has taught us that we must rely on ourselves, on us, and everyone prefers that we should do things and not others. This has been so since 1948. Anyway, I don't want to speak about the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. Of course, there are two different people. Very different people. Maybe one thought like this and the other thought like that. Maybe they started by having the same position but they eventually changed. But militarily speaking, anyway, I think that the army was significantly prepared for that scenario. There was a very high level of preparedness and commitment without giving any thought to maybe they're not meaning what they're saying, whatever. The military was prepared, and the army is still, as part of its basic ideology, preparing for all options. And it doesn't really matter why someone started it. There's a capacity. It's in our toolkit, and we can use it, and maybe someone may decide to use it, and it's as simple as that.
I'd like to answer the question a little differently. If the United States cannot assure its allies that we will, if the United States speaking for itself, we will be responsible for their security, and I'm not sure what country would ever allow that to occur, you can't blame another country for wanting to protect their people. And this applies to Iran not only in the case of the nuclear program, but in terms of Saudi Arabia on Yemen. If you can't keep the Iranians out of Yemen, then you can't blame the Saudis for saying, we see what Israel faces on its border from Lebanese Hezbollah. Do we want to have that in Sa'ada, Yemen, a few hundred miles from Mecca? We will do whatever we can to stop that. And if you criticize them for doing that, you need to step back and say, well, what did you do to stop that? So if Israel had that conversation, and the intelligence world, we don't talk about those things, if they had that conversation, that actually speaks to a sense of perhaps Israel's belief as to where the international community stood in terms of its own defense against Iran. And in the future, well, I think it's a little unlikely. If you were the supreme leader of Iran now, and Amos, we have a lot of cameras back there, so if this is going to appear on a web page, I'm sure the IRGC will watch this. You've got to wonder if Mossad has just grabbed your most sensitive nuclear material. There's nothing that could be more sensitive than this. What the hell can't they find out about in Iran? So you may want to be a little careful of running to that nuclear weapons program with that in mind. So I don't think this will happen in the near term, but that's a decision that the Israeli policymakers have to take.
אוקיי, לסיום השאלות שלי, אנחנו תכף נפתח את האפשרות לקהל להפנות שאלות גם. הייתי רוצה מצד... אני חושב שהשגרירה, אנחנו לא נשאל אותה על סיכויי התקיפה
Okay, I can answer.
Never say never.
Of course, I agree to what my colleague said about the fact that if the allies of the United States don't feel their security guaranteed by the United States, they have to have their own security done by themselves. That's what we are doing in France, and we hope that Europe will do the same. And we are pushing our European friends to work on a European defense, because when you hear sometimes that President Trump is not sure about NATO, it means you have to do your own European defense. So I agree completely with that. But on the other hand, the military tool is not the only tool. And what I'm hearing here is that if like there was only one tool in the world, the military tool. Of course, you have to have a strong military tool to be strong politically and diplomatically. But don't forget to use these as a tools. And that's why I was talking about political solutions to the crisis in the Middle East, because military solutions are not always the best. We were talking about Yemen. It can be a nightmare in terms of military involvement for years. And I hope not. I hope it will be settled. But there is also a need for political tools. You need stronger states in the Middle East to be able to tackle themselves. The Iranian proxies or other kind of terrorist groups in their own countries. And you have to reinforce these states to be able to do it with political tools also.
Thank you. That's an important point, and I should learn my lesson about not being too polite regarding questions.
So last question that I'd like to ask the panelists, perhaps in brief, is the reasonable scenario for next year, a year from today? Or we'll be stuck in the same position or a completely different situation? I think more or less where we are at the moment, some more economic pressure against Iran, but something that they can actually take upon their shoulders. Still hasn't made a decision to actually retreat from the actual agreement. They're waiting out. Yeah, they're going to be waiting. First of all, they're going to be waiting for the elections of sort of mid-term in the States. But they're also invested in that special investigators' work, yes. I think if the midterm kind of elections, nothing dramatic happens and there's no breakthrough between North Korea and the United States, then the most significant thing that might change is really a deterioration of the economic situation in Iran, and therefore a readiness, if not formally, then perhaps non-formally, to cede on the sort of enclosing areas like Yemen, Syria, etc. Again, I don't think that they're going to pull out of the agreement, and I can't see it happening at the moment. And does this radiate in some way and penetrate what the previous people said about the northern front here with us? Yes, definitely. We've already seen changes on our northern front. That stick that is going to become stronger and stronger, and it may actually, perhaps in a more covert manner, but we can see that the various air companies that are coming into Syria to come and save people. I think that people are willing, they're willing to pay the price, perhaps in Yemen. Ambassador?
Regarding you may not have heard my question. I asked about the most likely scenario within a year from now.
Well, I think that if Iran is still in the deal, in the JCPOA, I think the situation would be more or less the same. But I'm afraid that the economic consequences of the sanctions in Iran will reinforce those in Iran who are the hawks and the toughest, both for nuclear issues and also regional issues.
Thank you, Mr. Roule.
I made a prediction this morning I want to repeat for those who didn't hear it. Bibi Netanyahu and the Supreme Leader will not be meeting in the next year. I think Iran will probably stay in the deal. It will probably take out some of its nuclear program from the mothballs to just press diplomacy a little harder. I don't worry so much about the nuclear issue because I don't believe Iran will go towards a weapon in the coming year. But what I worry about is that they will continue to solidify and expand their external activity, and this activity could provoke a response from Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain with a terrorist action, and that this could take the region into a very, very bad place quickly. if there is an anti-ship cruise missile shot on a vessel in the Red Sea, this could move things in a bad way. I'd like to mention detainees for a minute. There is an unprecedented number of foreign detainees held by Iran on the most outrageous and ludicrous of charges of many nationalities. I think this might get worse as well. Iran has shown a capacity to let some of these folk out for a few days, but Iran, and I'll close on this, we've talked a lot about the blame for Donald Trump for leaving the deal, or Europe isn't doing enough, or Israel wanted to go to war. But the bottom line of this is that Iran was offered a chance through JCPOA to become a reasonable country, and it didn't choose to do so. It could have let detainees go. It could have not created militias, Afghan militias in Syria. It could have not sent anti-ship cruise missiles to Yemen. Its leadership chose to do this. I think they're going to continue to make bad decisions in the coming year.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to open it up to the audience, and I'd like to make my usual request that these be questions and not lectures, please, from the audience. For the two Americans on the stage, can you identify? My question is, can you identify the conditions, if they do exist, that the Trump administration will give an instruction, a directive, that America should attack the nuclear facilities in Iran? Can you see that happening? To the two Americans, that America would attack? Yes. I know that when I served in an administration that was willing to attack, had it been required. I know that Amos doesn't believe me so much, but yes, my president was. Had there been no alternative to... Have there been any breakthrough in that program? Yes. But thanks to the JCPOA, we are very distant from it. But if it is violated and if they continue advancing and Israel doesn't and there's no other option, then I suggest that this president will also attack. I'm sure that he doesn't want to. I don't think he wants to start going into another war in the Middle East. But those two administrations, basically, it's the same idea without, if they're against all odds, if there's no alternative. Yes?
My crystal ball is as good as anyone else's in the room. But I think in two cases, I think if there is evidence that Iran has restarted its weaponization program and international diplomatic and sanctions pressure isn't enough to stop that very quickly. And secondly, if there is an attack of a successful attack of some sort by Iran's military or their surrogates against Americans in the region or in the United States. And I should note, we've just detained two alleged Iranian agents in the United States who were surveilling Jewish facilities in the United States. That is not espionage, that's a prelude for terrorism.
I'd like to add another word. The reason that we have a military option is because Obama built it up. We didn't have one when he was elected, and we have one since 2012 because of his directives. I'm sorry, I can't hear what was said.
Thank you. I'm afraid the screening of this panel to the Iranian websites is on delay because the speaker of the spokesperson for the foreign ministry said a few hours ago that I'm keeping you in suspense that the Iranians have extended views with the Europeans on the nuclear program, and we have, and I quote him, "We have given the necessary warnings to the Europeans, and we will not wait much more." So, following your statements, Ambassador Regal, what other tools the Europeans have, seeing that the Iranians and Larijani, the Speaker of the Parliament, said on Saturday that he doesn't believe that the can give Iran what they need to economically to keep them in the JCPOA.
Okay, he doesn't believe Europe, but we don't believe Iran, so it's, I mean, our only policy is to maintain Iran within the JCPOA, and we will continue to do it, because we think it's in the interest of everybody, in the interest of Europe, in the interest of the US, of Israel, and of Iran itself. So we will continue that, and we don't believe the threats of Iran.
Okay, שאלות נוספות?
Additional questions?
אולי נחכה שנייה שהמיקרופון יגיע.
Could we just maybe wait for the microphone to reach him, says the moderator. I'd like to ask a technical question. No. Oh, could you ask someone to repeat it? I can't hear what's being said. Sorry, impossible. A number of words were said by Mr. Roule and by Ambassador Legal, but the information that we have received is extremely thin. Are we talking about the removal of the core from the actual facility of the reactor and the installing of a facility like the model in Canada that cannot actually manufacture plutonium, at least not to a military extent. And then it was published that the Iranians are negotiating with the Chinese, not with the Canadians. But up to now, I've never found any information about what phase of this conversion of the reactor are they at, because in the JCPOA, there's no sort of schedule of timing. Maybe that's part. Maybe that was perhaps impacted by the politics, and therefore it wasn't really in earnest. I'm asking the panel, do you know what this conversion of the reactor in Iraq is at? And if the steps were taken, are they irreversible?
So maybe I'll start with that. In the center of the Iraq reactor, there is a series of, we'll call them pipes. These pipes were filled with cement, and this was removed from the reactor. The reactor can no longer be used. You cannot take cement from the pipes. Now, this said, one of the Iranian negotiators, their current ambassador to London, in January stated publicly this did not happen. He lied. It did happen. The Iraq reactor is no more. Within the deal, the creation of a new reactor would have been a reactor, and I'm not a nuclear scientist, and this is nuclear science difficulty, similar to the Canadian reactor you mentioned, in that it would produce plutonium at a very different level, and the plutonium would be removed from country after use, and a number of other constraints would go into this new facility to ensure that were it misused by the Iranians to create material for a weapon, there would be plenty of advance notice to the international community and the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's a very sophisticated, and the science is very strong behind this. But this would take years of negotiations, planning, how do you pay for this? This was just it's in the initial phases. There may be other folk on the panel who have some better data than that, but that's what I know.
Definitely is that.
Just one sentence, and as it was said, the reactor no longer exists there, and of course it would take time, and it's going to take a long time. There's a long tail to it. So in the past they tried to do some kind of conversions in Bruxelles, but it's very difficult to do, technologically speaking, and to do so in a covert manner. I think that that's something we would know about a long time in advance, should they be doing anything like that. Look, there's no reactor, no active reactor in Iraq, so let's leave it. Any other questions, please?
כבוד השגריר, התייחסת פעמיים לאור
Ambassador Dan
הירוק.
Shapiro, you spoke about the
השאלה היא,
green
האם
light.
יש הגדרה
Is
מדויקת
there an accurate
בין שני
definition
הצדדים? מה
between
זאת
both
אומרת אור
sides?
ירוק?
What do you mean green
הכוונה היא
light? Do you
למחויבות ארצות
mean
הברית.
the United States commitment?
לא, אני לא בטוח שיש
No, I'm
הגדרה
not
טכנית
sure that there is a technical definition, an accurate one, for this green light.
גם לא לאור
And
האדום
I
או
don't think
צהוב.
even for a red or a yellow or a sort of
היה
amber
ידוע,
light. It was known
ב-2011
in
ו-2012
2011 and 2012 that the United States did not want there to be an Israeli attack in order to give time to the
וגם בגלל
diplomats.
שלנו הייתה
And also
אופציה
because
צבאית
we
איכותית יותר.
wanted to have a more sort of top quality military option. I don't know whether it's red, amber.
כל מדינה היא ריבונית.
State is sovereign to itself, and we always said that. We said that openly and also covertly, sort of behind the scenes. Every sovereign country can decide for itself. We have our vested interests. We have, yes, perhaps we do wield pressure against you, but you decide what you are going to do. We don't decide for you. I think it's between amber and red from the point of view of the color of the light. But Israel should have taken that into account, what price it will have to take if it decides to attack. And green light, no, it's not technically
קודם כל, אותה אמירה שאתם ריבונים, אתם יכולים להחליט.
We know that you're sovereign and you can make your own decisions, and we do not have a recommendation to you. We don't have a vested interest in persuading you to do either that or the other. It's amber the light. So what is green? Okay, it's between amber and green. You know, sometime in Israel, boy, do they actually go right through the red lights.
I have a question to Ambassador Lagal. Madam Ambassador, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei calls every day to destruction of the State of Israel. The Iranians say that they never engage to make nuclear weapons, but a Mossad operation in Tehran, in Shahrabad district, says something else. He made it to the Iranian have secret project of nuclear weapon, Project Ahmad, that managed by Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. So how France, that once of the best ally of the State of Israel, can be in the JCPOA, the agreement of anti-Iranian nuclear weapons, if the agreement is based on lies? And how do you, if the France can be sure that Iran never get nuclear weapons again? Thank you.
That because Iran is lying, that's why we engage in the JCPOA. If we believed Iran, we would have believed Iran when they were saying that they had no nuclear program. We knew, and it was much more before the archives. It was 20 years ago. We knew that they were having a program, and that's why we try to make them stop this program through different means. At the beginning, it was UN Security Council, sanctions, etc. And at the end, it was the JCPOA. So we don't believe Iran. No doubt about that. Second, we are keeping the JCPOA alive in the interest of Israel. We think it's in the interest of Israel that the JCPOA is still into force and that Iran is respecting the JCPOA, because Iran, and we can verify it or by the agency or by the different intelligence system, including the one of Israel, we can verify that Iran is keeping into the JCPOA, which is in the interest of Israel. So we are not acting against Israel, on the contrary.
שאלות נוספות?
Any additional
טוב,
questions?
אנחנו נסיים בזה.
Okay,
אני
let
רוצה
us
להודות לכל משתתפי
conclude,
הפאנל.
and I'd like to thank all the participants.
הדיון הבא ייפתח ב-3:00.